Hi, I'm Paul, and today I want to talk about Unity terrains, and I want to try and help people that are trying to learn it, because when you start working with terrains, you start hearing all sorts of strange terms like biomes and splat maps, and to be honest, it didn't make any sense to me, and I'll try and explain what I think they mean and how to use them. So if that sounds interesting, carry on watching. Okay, so here we have a scene and we've got a terrain in it. And with a terrain, you can have this concept of painting textures. And you use these terrain layers to be the sort of brush that you're going to use for the terrain. So, for example, I could paint this kind of rock in here, or I could paint this small pebble things in here. And you just go along and you can paint them, and you can change the brush type, brush size, all sorts of things like that. And you can just carry on and paint all these areas in. I could paint like a sandy beach in here and a kind of rocky outcrop on these ridges. I could do all of that. But it is pretty time consuming, and actually it's quite difficult to do, because as you paint the things in, this patterns start to arrive that you don't really want. I mean, even in this one here, you can see this kind of regular pattern here, and it looks very computer-like and not realistic. So we want to turn to some kind of alternative. And one tool I'm using at the moment, just for this example, is something called Vegetation Studio Pro. Now, this is a really good tool for putting things in like plants and trees and rocks and sort of bits of stuff to just lay around the terrain and to make it look quite realistic, and so you have like some meadows or mountain woodland and things like that. You can create really nice visuals using Vegetation Studio Pro. But you can just use it on its own to do something called biomes. Now, this phrase biomes is used in a lot of different tools. So I know Guy uses it, and certainly Vegetation Studio Pro uses it. Ram River Utilities has the concept of biomes. And really what a biome is I think of it as a collection of things to represent an area. So you might have a sand and a kind of beachy river plants, and you might want to call that the sea biome or seafront biome. And then you might have like a jungle biome where you'd have got kind of big trees and all the sort of plants that you might get growing in the jungles and different grasses. And then you might have a mountain biome. You can have all these different biomes, and really all what you're doing is you're kind of creating a collection, a profile of different things that you want to put in a particular area, just to make it easier. So that's really what a biome is, and depending on the tool, the biome can mean different things. So let's just look at what Vegetation Studio Pro does for biomes. So if we come in here, you can see that I've already added something called the river biome. And if we look in this, so this has got 8 textures. So again, these are the textures that you got from the same as the terrain. And with Vegetation Studio Pro, it's not necessarily the right tool for doing texture painting, but it will do it. So here we have them set up. Now, you would add other things into the biome too. So we can come back into Vegetation Studio Pro and we look at edit biomes. So I can add new grasses, new plants, new trees, new objects, new large objects, sort of 2D grasses, 2D plants. So all these things will then all become part of the river biome. So whenever we want to use a river biome, these are things that go into it. So hopefully I haven't over-egged what a biome means too much, and without an example, maybe it's kind of losing the thread a little bit. But really, I think the biome is a reasonably easy thing to understand. And if we look at this ram spline here, so this is a river auto material. I think that probably gives quite a good example. So in here we go to Vegetation Studio and you can add a vegetation biome. And we've added the river biome, add vegetation mask. So this is the Vegetation Studio Pro mask here. So this area here, this mask, is basically saying, see, you can see here on the thing brackets river, that the biome from Vegetation Studio Pro is going to be applied within this mask area. So when I define things for a river, I might define sort of pebbly underneath the water and sand, and maybe a little bit of kind of flat rocks to go around the edges of the river. All these things I can define in Vegetation Studio Pro using the river biome. And if I wanted to make it a mountain river or a jungle river, I could create different biomes that has different sorts of vegetation, different kind of rock formations. So you can quite understand that the power of a biome is that the fact that you can kind of swap it in and out of things, and you can quite easily reapply it to another asset in another part of the terrain quite quickly. So that's the sort of benefit of the biome. Now, if we go back to Vegetation Studio Pro and we look at the biome thing again, we look back at these terrains. Now, remember I said that the terrain's about painting, and painting a terrain is quite awkward. So what you can do is if you just take a step back and think, well, what are the rules that I'm using when I want to paint this terrain? And then if you can define those rules in your head, then the Vegetation Studio Pro biome allows you to generate something called a splat map. Now, I'm not going to get into exactly what a splat map is, because I've seen so many arguments online about what the exact definition is. So all I'm going to say is I'm going to sort of sideways move out the way of that argument and just say this is how I treat what is called a splat map. And what I think a splat map is, or how I use it, is we look back at this terrain, and what I would say was anywhere that's really flat on and we grass, and then as we get slightly steeper, I want to have the grass maybe slightly less grass, and if it's like really steep like these edges, I don't really want hardly any grass on there. I want it really to be rock. So I have all these kind of inbuilt rules that we know from nature, and when I'm painting, that's kind of what I'm using to understand what sort of material I want to put onto the terrain. And what we can do with a splat map is we can say, well, let's apply these rules to the terrain. So if we look at this grass, so I select the grass terrain here, and then we get two basic rules that Vegetation Studio Pro allows you to use to define a splat map. Now, other tools will use different mechanisms. So this is just one example. So it has two concepts. It has a height and a steepness. Now, what height means, if we click this first point here, we get at 0 meters above sea level, we've got 100% density. So at 0, we are saying that this grassy texture, we can have loads of it. And then as you move along the x-axis, then the height goes up. So now we're at 50 meters. And if I was to move this along, 55, going higher and higher up in the air, and then we can put curves into this, right? But just for now, we're just going to say that basically any height, we can have grass. And then in a similar way, we've got a steepness. So the steepness is at 0 degrees, so we're kind of moving up and down the degrees. We can have a lot of grass, and when it's really steep, we can still have a lot of grass. So just for this test case, we're basically saying that anywhere can have grass. Now, if we look at something like the sand, what I've done is I've dropped this down to 0. So all these other ones are all at 0, i.e. I don't really want to see them. Hence why when you look at this terrain, it's all grass. Now, to help you do that, there's this other concept of heat maps. And what a heat map does is it allows you to see what changes you're going to make to the splat map. So this splat map, again, just to use this term again, that I think the splat map is basically the collection of rules, and in Vegetation Studio Pro's case, these rules are your height and your steepness rules. So we're going to create a map of where to paint all these different things by using these rules. That's what I think of as the splat map. So as a quick interlude, I decided to have another look at what the definition of a splat map was, because I don't like to leave us with that kind of strange, well, this is what I think a splat map is. So what it's generating here, as we can see on this polycount.com, wiki.polycount.com, is this is what the splat map looks like. So this is kind of like a texture, just showing us, it's like a texture map in of itself, i.e. the different colors represent different textures that are going to be painted onto your terrain. So in our case, this might be sand, and that might be pebbles, and then so that's how we generate. This is a splat map, and how we generate it is using tools like Vegetation Studio Pro or Gaia, etc. So yeah, that's what a splat map is. And again, might not technically be accurate, but this is just the way I comprehend it in order to continue. So let's put this heat map on. Let's just go back to Vegetation Studio Pro. Let's get this object off. Okay. So put show heat map on. So this is for the first grass, and we can see it's all black. Whereas if I go to the sand, it's all pretty much all white. In fact, there's a tiny little bit of sand being applied here on the edge of that cliff. Not really sure why that is. There we go. Yeah, it's definitely just river. Okay, well, okay. Somehow there's a bit of sand being added onto here, and a little bit here. Kind of weird, not sure why that is. Same for all of these. It's obviously something on the grass that I'm not quite covering. Anyway, that's the basic idea of it, is we've got this big mask. And now what I can do is, if I don't want grass to be absolutely everywhere, so we could say that when it becomes very steep, so that's at, what should we say, sort of about 50 degrees, we can start bringing the density of the grass down. And as you can see, as we do that, these white areas start appearing. So these are areas where it's very steep, and we're saying that, do you know what, I don't really want grass growing along those areas, and I can bring that right down to sort of about here. So what we should start seeing is less grass in these sorts of areas. So let's turn the heat map back off on that. Now we need to put something else in, because the default is the grass. So what should we use? Let's say we put a bit of these rocks in, something very clear. So we put the heat map back on, and we say, well, the height, I'm going to say nothing at, well, quite close, maybe about here. Maybe we can start pulling that up. So as we get higher, there's more chance of rocks. That's not really pulling anything too dramatic into that mask. We're just getting these little bits here. But really, it's the rocks that I'm interested in. So once we get to very steep, now we should be able to add a key point in. So as our steepness goes up, you can play around trying to get a nice sort of curve. Trying to see where this becomes affected. I'm kind of expecting to see a little bit more on these ridges. Let's just turn the heat map back off a minute. Yeah, so here, for example, where it's quite steep, I'm not getting these rocks. So why is that? So now we're seeing a bit more of that edge. If I move this density in slightly lower angles, you can see it's really coming in quite thick. So that's probably quite good. Quite like that. So let's go back to our heat map. So what I've done is I've created a slightly different curve here. So we go back to our heat map, and on the steepness I've changed the gradient of the curve here, so we just go straight into these kind of dark areas and where it really is pretty steep. And then take the heat map off, generate, and you can see now that we've got where those steep bits were showing, we've got these kind of rocky features. And yeah, maybe it's not right, but it's got that kind of texture in there. And anywhere basically on the map that fulfills that rule, can't really see it there because of the lighting, but you can see the kind of rock face there and the rocks there. So really what we've done here with this kind of splat map thing is we're saying that wherever we're going to have something that's really steep, we want to apply these rules to it. Have we got anywhere else that we might want to do that? Yeah, maybe not. So now we want to think about what other sort of things we can do. So let's maybe play around with height and say this is going to be like an island. So we might want to say, well, let's have the sand on, and we're going to say we want sand to be very dense near sea level and really peter off quite quickly. So I'm just trying to think how high this terrain is actually above sea level. So we'll just try and use the mask. Come down here, get this mask back on again. Show heat map. And let's find out. So the steepness we can probably live with, small degree, and something along there, quite narrow. You don't really want to get sand. In this case, sand dunes you might have, but in our case, I want anything that's reasonably flat to be sandy. And then the height, so we should be. I don't know why I'm not seeing any sand come in. Okay, so there's the height. That's the steepness. It's actually saying that we're quite steep still. That's interesting. So we just set that to any height, just deal with the steepness. So at 0 degrees steepness, the density, yeah, we want that. And then this is the angle. So as we bring the angle in, so now only the really flat areas are going to be sandy. So around about there. So if we take the mask, show heat map off, let's try that. Okay, so now we've got a lot more sand. So it's a kind of a sandy island. And it saved us doing all of that painting ourselves. So it's filled in all of that area. There's kind of a bit of greenery in there as we start to hit the slopes. But yeah, we've got the sand in there now. And then maybe what we could do with the pebbles is do something similar, but make it where the slope's higher. So if we go to, just have a good look at that. So it's a height. So we go to pebbles, put the heat map on, hardly any pebbles. So let's just put the height map to anywhere. Now then, so we want this to be actually not when it's flat. So I don't want any when it's really flat. And then the steepness goes up. So I probably want to put another key point in here. Another key. So what I'm looking for is I don't actually want it too steep. So I'm trying to pick up where I kind of want fairly gentle. I can't find, there we are, somewhere. It's quite tricky. So how do you, I'm trying to show you what I'm trying to do. What I'm looking at is these bits in here that are going to form some kind of path or riverbed or a road path. And I think that they're going to be quite flat, but they're going to be quite high. So I would think that what I want actually is quite a low, oops, put the map back on. So I want something that's quite flat. Let's just delete that key. So still not picking that up. So it's not the height, because we've got that covered. So it's interesting. How do you pick up? So yeah, that's it. So I don't want, this is too picking up these areas here, and I don't want that because they're steep as well. So you want to say, okay, let's bring in those angles. So actually we're only interested in a little short range between this kind of steepness and here, and that's kind of picking up those paths. And then, because I don't want the height, so I can bring the height down. So this has to be, so I want to say it's going to be quite high up, but no higher. So I want quite a tight range for the height. Trying to get that. So there, we've got no path. There we're bringing the path back in, but we're also picking up those other bits. I can get rid of those with the steepness. It's quite tricky. See what that does. Heatmap off. Let's apply that. Oh, hang on. Yeah, it's got that on there. Don't seem to be seeing the results. So you'd expect this big patch here. I actually can. It's quite difficult to see. But these pebbles are kind of splattering this area around here. You can just pick them out. It's just because the terrain texture itself isn't so strong. Is there anything we can do with that? Texture weight. I wonder if I can increase that. Does that do much? Yeah, you can see that that's added. More of those stones now in there, and you can see that path is. Yeah, you can see it's picking out that map a lot more now. You can see it with your eyes, even from this distance. Whereas that's probably not. Well, maybe it is what I want. Yeah, you can really see the stones. Whereas if we change that weight down, back to sort of maybe 2. Yeah, the stones are starting to merge more with the other textures. So it's not quite as a strong level. And then back to 1, which was the original. Oops. Yeah, you can still see it. Now I know what I'm looking for. I can kind of still see it. So it's quite tricky. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. And that's kind of like a brief introduction into biomes and Splatmap rules anyway for Unity, certainly using Vegetation Studio Pro. Now, Vegetation Studio Pro probably isn't the correct tool to be doing this painting with. I mean, it can do it, and that's fine. You can play around with this and do it, but actually products like Gaia, I think, have a stronger story when it comes to generating these, and that's something that I'll look at adding next. Okay, thanks.